wait for low tide and we can meet down at the beach and ride our bikes in intertidal zones when the forces of the moon condone, and if we miss our chance we'll...
Hello, welcome to the world of wings, worms, and wonder. I'm Kelly Johnson, your Creative Nature Connection guide, and happy Wonder Wednesday 107. This week, in anticipation for World Watercolor Month, next month, July, we're going to be tackling a little something that can often be frustrating for beginning painters or novice painters, and that is brush versus paint. It is quite of a challenge sometimes to really have that feel. It just comes with experience of how your brush should be loaded with paint. So you have enough paint / water ratio on your brush that it flows, but not so much that the paint's too saturated in what you're trying to paint or that it makes a blob of water onto your page and goes out of the lines or wherever you want it. So really understanding the nuance of this balance, it just comes with practice and time. But there are a few tricks of the trade that can help speed up that practice and set you off on the right path, set you off for success with discovering and finding out and intuiting. The intuition comes from hours and hours of experience, but being able to just intuit, oh yeah, my brush is loaded just how I want it to paint this particular area of this painting. In a nature journal, on a bigger piece of paper, a watercolor paper, mixed media paper, they all behave slightly differently. So that also is something that comes with experience and practice of knowing how wet or how much paint should be loaded onto a brush to achieve the effects you want. But first things first, brush versus paint. Let's explore some tips and tricks that you can practice along with me here in this video and after to come of how to load that brush up with paint for a way that will set you up for painting success. All right, meet me over at the painting. Okay, to begin, we have some paper, scratch paper, paper towel, paintbrushes, just standard pan watercolor paint, and some water. So first things first, I've just got two types of brushes here, just a flat and a round. So we'll experiment with both types, but let's set the flat to the side for now. We'll start with the round. One thing that novice painters often do of all ages is, this is the ferrule, these are the bristles. They dip the bristles too far into the water, or paint for that matter, up almost, or covering the ferrule even. When you're loading a brush with water and or paint, you definitely only want to dip it in about halfway, even a brush that's totally dry like this one. So dipping it in, but you see, I am not going very far in. See, I only went to about here. If I go up past this line where the bristles go into the ferrule, that means water's going up here into where the bristles are glued in. And think of it almost like a sponge. All that water, when you tip your brush, it's gonna come out. It's been absorbing up here, and it's gonna pour out thanks to gravity. So definitely never, when loading your brush, you may, when you're cleaning your brush, put it all the way in if it's really dirty, but really just dabbing it against the side to clean your brush should be enough. And then scraping it like this for cleaning the paint. Things can be different when you're working with acrylic and or oils. Oils, you're not using water anyway, but we're talking watercolor paint today. So dip your brush in. This brush is damp now, so I just need a little dip of just about a third maximum of the bristles. Now my paint is completely dry right now too, and with watercolor paint, we know we need to add a certain amount of water to get the paint flowing, but if we add too much water, it's going to be not saturated enough, it's going to be too runny. Any number of situations can result. So I dip this in. I am not dabbing my brush off right now because I need to get a little bit of extra water in there to get the paint flowing. Maybe I get one more dip into the water and get the paint flowing. Now I can see that that looks good. I can see here that there's a little puddle in my pan. I can see the color changing a little bit. Now, do I want to go right down into my page what I want to paint just like this? No, this brush is heavily loaded with paint because I've been stirring the water in to get the paint going. See, that's heavily loaded with paint. So I want to test it on my scratch paper and then probably rinse it off completely, and see how I'm just dabbing, not dipping that whole brush down into the bottom. Then I take my paper towel. I always say, paper towel is one of your best friends in watercolor painting, and dab it off. I'm not worried about getting my brush completely clean right now, and this color green kind of stains anyway, but I want to dab all that excess water out of my brush. Now, dip it back in a little bit, get a little paint, maybe, back and forth a couple times, and then test it. Now that looks pretty good. See, it didn't go too saturated to fading. It's just sort of an even light green color for the underpainting, or the first layer. Now dip a little more water, a little more paint, and then we can get more of a feel. Okay, I think my paint is good here. And once you get a feel for how the paint is flowing, then you can add it. And you may need to dilute. So dip in the water, dab on the paper towel, and go in a little more lightly. Just add some water. Remember, I always say let the paint do the work. But you also want to make sure you have the right tool for the job. And if your brush is too heavily loaded with paint, then it's not the right tool for the job, right? Now, what if you have too much water? So say I just dip my brush in the water, dip it in the paint, and take it right to my page. Well, that's a lot of water. What if I wanted to add, say, some yellow into this, and I just went straight saturation? Well, that's not really very nice. That's kind of heavy-handed, right? Into the water, onto the paper towel, tiny dip in the water, test on my test scratch paper, and then we can sort of dilute this, come back, blend it in a little better. But we could have avoided having to fix that if we had loaded our brush properly the first time. So see, we can come back here with a nice, subtle color mixing. Okay, what if you want to make a nice, tight, smooth line? We get our color going. And if I go straight in to my paper right after getting the brush so loaded with paint, it's just too drippy. Look at the bristles. They're not very organized. It's very sort of, this is a brush that's in nice condition. If your brush isn't in very good condition, it will be even more frazzled at the end. So I can take this, got a new scratch paper here to show you, and I just sort of twist my brush on the scratch paper. And notice how it starts to bring my bristles into a point. And it also gets rid of some of that excess water and paint. And until I feel like, okay, well, that's pretty nice. Maybe that's still too much water, and I dab it. And sometimes if you want to get some water out but not get the paint out, you can dab up towards the ferrule. Because again, the brushes are like little straws that are sucking the paint and water up in, not into the hair of the brush, but into the spaces in between the bristles of the brush. And now I can get a nice sharp line that I never could have gotten when my brush was all thick with paint and water. And I could do lettering, or I could just do, texture on something, but nice, thin, straight lines. Let's try again. Rinse our brush by just dabbing it against the edge. Scrape it off on the edge. Dab it on the paper towel. Oh, didn't get all my color out. Dab it a little bit more in the water. Again, this is getting very full of water. That's a nice, like, thick, fat brush. So scrape some of that out. Dab it off on your paper towel. And sometimes I even just do this afterwards with my finger to get it in a point. Go into our paint. Test it. This time my paint might be a little dry, so that's why I'm always testing it. But if I wanted a very saturated straight line, a little dry could be better. But it all depends. And you can see here my paint, it's got no puddle of water in it, so it's getting a little thick. We can get a little more texture this way, you can see. So we can dab a tiny bit. See, I just put the tip in and it gets the paint even in the water. A little bit more water into the paint. You can even brush it off on here. And now that looks pretty nice. For getting some nice smooth shapes and lines. I can just dip my brush into the water if I want to use up some of the paint that's on it. And that way, in this case, when I'm wetting an area, a lot of water loaded in my brush is fine. That's not like a fine, detailed painting technique. But when I want to then go back in and maybe add some of these lines, dip my brush in the paint, give it a twist to organize those bristles, and then I can get some nice lines going in some different techniques here, right? We've got some wet on wet, we've got some dry brush, but mastering these techniques in part is mastering or becoming comfortable and confident with loading your brush. It's all about just playing around with it. Go back into my yellow, can add some more, Again, I would want more saturation if I'm trying to, more saturation, more paint on my brush, the darker I want my strokes to be. Now, what about a flat brush? Is that any different? Not really. Same technique. Dip it in the water, dab it on the paper towel, put it in your paint. Now let's see. Too dry still. If I'd put that right onto my paper, and there's no painting over in watercolor really. Hardly any erasing. You can also see that the bristles are shorter on this flat brush. That's not necessarily always the case. Some flat brushes have long bristles. This just happens to have short. So the water may get up into the ferrule a little bit more, which means you may want to dab it on an angle a little more often. But again, dipping a little bit in. Let's see, we'll go for a new color. Go for red this time so we can tell them apart. And that's a lot of water there. Yeah, see, too runny. So I can dab that off on my paper towel. Go back into my paint. Test it again. Oh, now that I've got more detail with. See those sharp edges? I can whatever you might be painting. And need more paint. If you have a larger palette, you can even load, if you have a flat brush like this, you can load more paint onto one side of the brush. Let's see if I can make this happen on the top of my palette here. I may be able to get a little more. So the paint is actually a little dry for this. But you can kind of get the idea. If you have a nice wide flat palette, you can organize your paint on it so that you get a fade. Or it can go from more like dark blue to light blue in a single stroke. Or more like that. But again, that all comes with practicing loading your brush, just different ways to load the brush. See, dry here, we've got some texture, whereas wet here, we don't really have as much of that texture. It's pretty light, but you can kind of see. Okay, let's recap. Loading the brush. Brush into water, not dipping past the ferrule. Dab it on the paper towel. That gets your brush bristles sort of conditioned and ready to go. Brush back into water. Brush into paint. Test it on your scratch paper. Make strokes until you feel that it looks like what you want it to look like. Maybe get a tiny bit more paint and take it to the page. Dab that brush off. We rinse our brush. We press it against the side so we don't oversaturate past that ferrule. Dab it off. Go for our next color. Oh, that one's too dry. Even though I got paint on it, it's very dry. A little more water. Get that paint flowing. Test it on our scratch paper. Again, too wet. Dab that off. Take it to your paint, scratch paper. Paint, scratch paper. However many times you need to. And then take it to the paper. When you find, as you can see here, it started to get a little dry. Let me do a tiny dip, just the tiniest dip, and dab, paint. Dip, dab, paint, repeat. Then clean the brush. And this is not your like end of painting session clean. This is your just like middle of painting session clean. End of painting session clean is done in the sink, of course. And I have a brush care video that I can link to for this for y'all too. So dip, dab, dip, paint, dab, scratch paper, dab, dip, paint, scratch paper, dab. Finally get to your regular paper. However many times you need to dip, dab, and scratch paper, do that until you're completely comfortable and happy with how much paint is loaded, and also just play around with it. As much of this kind of thing that you can do, just abstract, this is basically doodling with paint. No plan, no outcome other than to literally just get a feel for the water, the paint, brush versus water, brush versus paint, paint versus water, play with saturation, play with the saturation of the paint on your brush. If I have a whole lot of water and a tiny bit of paint, it's going to be quite light, right? And if I have dabbed my brush and have very little water already in my brush and a lot of paint, it's going to be very thick and dark, right? That's very washy and watery.
And this brush just started doing something that flat brushes or even round brushes after a while will do. They might start to get a split in them like that. That means the brush is just too wet. Just set it, it's gotten water up in the ferrule. You've been painting with it too long. Set it aside and get a new brush. Don't fight it. When they start to split, it is just, that goes for if you're painting your house too, walls. The brush is splitting like that, let it dry. Clean it and let it dry. So remember, dip, even with a round brush. Dip, dab, dip, paint, scratch paper. Ooh, that came nice right out the gates. It's kind of hard. Once you know how to do it, it's a little like riding a bike. It's actually kind of hard to do it incorrectly because it goes against every fiber of my being to dip this brush all the way down. Do not clean your brush by smashing it down into the bottom of the paint cup. You can get away with that with acrylic sometimes, but do not do that with watercolor. Just dab it on the side. I can't stress that enough. This move, dipping the bristles in and scraping them off, and paper towel. Dip, scrape, dab. That can be sort of like your rhythm. You can do a dance to it even. Dip, scrape, dab, paint, scratch paper, dip, paint, scratch paper, real paper. All right, so practice, practice, practice. Paint as much as you possibly can in World Watercolor Month, the month of July each year, because what better time than World Watercolor Month to dedicate to watercolor? And have fun with this, play with it, try not to get frustrated, test out all your different brushes, explore loading them with a lot of water and a little paint, a lot of water and a little paint, a little water and a lot of paint. Any old scratch paper, this is just leftover from something, can work. If you're working on a really finished piece of artwork, it is often nice to have your scratch paper be the same type and texture of paper as your piece of art, but it's definitely not 100% necessary. Brush versus paint, you can be the referee on that one.
All right, brush versus paint. You can do this. Just practice, practice, have fun with the practice, enjoy the process, and just relax into it. Be like the water in the paint. Try to flow into your process, flow across the page. And don't be afraid to just scribble, basically. Think of how a child will just paint all over the page and they're not worried about it. These are not masterpieces you're making. You can just swatch your paints, you can doodle, you can draw lines and designs. Just get a feel for the paint, get a feel for your brushes, and you will soon have that experiential intuition for when the paint and the water are just right on your page. So have fun with it. Happy Wonder Wednesday 107, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
And we can meet down at the beach and ride our bikes in intertidal zones when the forces of the moon condone. And if we miss our chance, we'll wait for half a tidal lunar day to have the space to ride our bikes on the wet sand in the night. And the bathymetric maps all show there's 100 different ways to go around the untouched